Welcome to the Great Humbling Podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020, I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening. Ed, it's the 22nd of October, 2024. I don't know what this is. I don't know if this is episode 1 of season 6. I don't know whether it's, I don't know where my arse and my elbow are. I know that I found myself thinking it's been too long since we had a conversation.
It's true.
And why don't we just get on a Zoom call and record it and see if this turns out to be an episode? How are you, my friend?
I'm very good. I'm sitting here in the seasonal temperature adjustment of autumn, which has finally arrived. So I'm slightly shivery in my shed, but that keeps me alert and sharp. I find.
And you've got your big beard on as well, which helps when it's getting cold.
I know. I was doing an event last week where I was lucky enough to interview Clover Hogan, the sort of very bright and very talented, very, very impressive, very wise beyond her years, young climate activist. And she's only like 25, but she started her first organization at 19, Force of Nature. And someone in the audience said it was like watching Gandalf and Frodo together on stage.
There you go.
I don't know. I'll sort of take that. I mean, I know the beard's got bigger. It's not quite Gandalf standard. I'm not sure my wisdom has reached Gandalf standard either, but it was a fun observation.
The beard's a good start, isn't it?
Exactly. I just need a carved staff now.
Oh, so how have you been? What else have you been up to?
Oh, I've been up to all sorts of things. I've been on the road a little bit. I know you have, and we'll get into, I guess, what it's been like on the road in the ruins, as I think you might describe it. So yeah, I've been doing a few things. Should we start with what I've been reading? That's usually a good place to begin.
Go for it.
Because otherwise I'll get sidetracked into all the other things I've done. So I finally got round to reading The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey, which I'd never read.
Me neither.
And I thought, I really need to read this book because I quote Edward Abbey all the time where he says, better a cruel truth than a comfortable delusion. And so I thought I need to pick it up, and I read it, and it's mesmerizing. I mean, it really is. I mean, I read it sort of immediately following How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Oh, right.
Andrea's mom. So it was quite a sort of double act to realize that, Monkey Wrench Gang was written in 1975, where the conclusion that Edward Abbey had come to then is like, well, it's time to blow shit up. Literally, let's go and blow up some bridges, let's go and destroy some mining equipment, let's blow up some bulldozers, let's disable these forestry machines. And it's such it's a brilliant novel, apart from anything else. It's beautifully written, very evocative of that sort of Utah landscape, very sort of dry and arid, but obviously the accelerating extractivism that was really gathering momentum then and impinging on these really wild and wonderful places. And it's just about a ragtag bunch of very unlikely folk who come together, sort of Vietnam veteran, a local dude, and a professional doctor, his very young girlfriend. It's like, and they set about, with a great logic and rationale and justification, for doing what Andrea's mom thinks we might be doing in the future. So yeah, it was a rattling good read, and I thoroughly recommend it. If you haven't picked it up before, then do so, because it's like a workbook that's fun.
I mean, Edward Abbey is one of those names where I really feel like I ought to have read.
Yeah, I mean,
Because he's mattered to a lot of people I've worked with.
he's so Dark Mountain.
Yeah, well, totally. And I mean, I'm sure a massive influence for Paul.
Yeah.
Now that I've heard Paul talk about Edward Abbey plenty of times. So yeah.
I think he was a complicated man. I mean, I think stuff I've read around Edward Abbey, you know, like many of these mavericks, I'm sure he wasn't a simple or easy character to brush up alongside, but that doesn't take away from his writing. And then I read, and then just to really lighten the mood, I read Death and the Penguin by Andrei Kirchhoff.
Never heard of it.
He's a Ukrainian writer, or Russian-Ukrainian writer, and it's in the best, you know, Bulgakov, dark satire, you know, brooding nature of the Russian-Ukrainian soul, which I guess you can't conflate these days, but let's say the Ukrainian soul. And it's just, again, it's a delicate work of genius, you know, where it's basically about a guy who is a journalist who lives with a penguin, which he adopted when the local zoo shut down and had to have the animals adopted by local people. And the penguin is just such an incredible character in the book. But in that classic dark tradition, he gets a job working on the local newspaper, writing obituaries. And he's instructed, you know, start to write obituaries for various local people in that preemptive way that obituary writers do before they actually die. And without giving too much away, it soon becomes clear that the obituaries he's writing are the hit list. And it's just one of those, you know, fascinating creative literary insights into what it must feel like to operate in one of those types of regimes where you don't really know what is going on, who's in control, or who to trust.
And is this set in kind of post-Soviet Ukraine? When is it? How?
Oh, that's true. Actually, it's hard to tell when it's set. I would say it must be set. It does reference it. I think it's set in the 90s.
Right. Yeah, that was sort of what I was imagining from your description of it. That it's kind of the era of kleptocracy and collapse.
Yeah. But I mean, but it's just brilliantly written. You know, it's one. It says on the front, it says a tragicomic masterpiece. I think it just about sums it up.
All right. Well,
what about you? Yeah, well,
I've got a masterpiece for you here. This is Quinn by M. Strang, which I think I sort of mentioned in passing in an earlier episode when I was just talking about that sense last year of there being a whole cluster of us who had been part of Dark Mountain, whose work as writers was kind of coming to fruit and coming to the fore in a new way. And there was
is she partner of Dougie?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And I mean, I first met Dougie came to the first Dark Mountain Festival in 2010. And at that time they were living at Lauriston Hall, which is an intentional community in the southwest of Scotland. And the two of them organized a thing called Carrying the Fire, which was a small Dark Mountain gathering a few months after the bigger festival, where I think there were about 40 of us. And it was where I first met Mike Small from Bella Caledonia, for example, who did the Fife Diet. And it was a really good gang of people who were together for a weekend. And so they're people who've been, you know, Em was poetry editor for a while for Dark Mountain. She was the lead editor for it was a poetry special issue quite early on. And you know, she's an award-winning poet, but this is her first novel, Quinn. And it's a kind of, it's a dream-like story. I mean, dark. It's told from within the mind and within the experience of a man who is, at the beginning of it, imprisoned for a murder that he's not admitted to himself that he committed. And he comes out of prison, and the mother of the girl who he murdered, and they'd grown up together, her mother, who is dying, invites him to come and live with her as her carer. And so it's partly a novel about forgiveness. And there's a point where she says, I'm not doing this for you. Like, speaking about forgiveness, I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. This sense that, forgiveness is almost the kind of last desperate act because nothing else has worked to heal, to begin a chance of healing. But it's not any kind of simple redemptive tale either. It's a really unusual novel. It's a novel of a poet, somebody whose ability to notice the power and weight of words, of repetition, to conjure something, to conjure experience, is guiding it. But it's also born out of M's own experiences of years and years of going into prisons and working with men in prisons as a writer. And part of why I wanted to talk about it is because M has also just, and we'll put the link to this in the show notes, just joined Substack, writing about some of the same things that are woven through the novel. I think she said she's kind of called to bringing together a conversation, which is kind of a frightening conversation to bring together, about violent men and about the whole history and tangle of everything around male violence and how to bring tenderness and a desire for healing and an inquiry into the possibility that we could show up differently together in ways that wouldn't repeat the patterns of male violence. And something about the way that she wrote that just made me say, yes, I feel like I'm showing up empty-handed, but I want to be a part of the conversation you're wanting to start. So I wanted to talk about the book partly because it's an amazing novel, but also partly because I wanted to just let others know that there's something, someone's writing something or speaking something and you hear, this is somebody with their work to do in the world. They're not doing this because they feel like it or they want to, doing it because they can't not. And that's where the really powerful work of all kinds, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about that as well. I mean, in connection to that, like night before last, I went to see an old friend's one-man show at Norwich Arts Centre, where we did the first Humbling live. And Simeon Morris, I've known him since I was a teenager. And he took his one-man show, it's called Square Peg. It's very much about masculinity, or masculinity is a key element of it. He took it to Edinburgh Fringe and won a First at the Fringe award. Had a really kind of great critical reception. And he was bringing it home, basically, having done, a couple of dozen shows at the Fringe and a couple in London. He was like bringing it back to his hometown. And it was really powerful. It was very poignant, but it was essentially talking about how when he was a teenager, or when he was about 10, actually, he's a bit younger, his dad had said to him, was castigating him one day, and his dad said to him, women are better than men. That's one thing you have to learn in life. And for Simeon, at a very impressionable age, the way he describes it in the show was that led him down a pathway of venerating the feminine, and he wasn't homosexual, wasn't gay, but he wore women's clothing, he wore makeup. For him, that was the empowering thing because women were better than men. And it led him into a very creative career as a fashion designer, wanting to make these beautiful dresses out of the most simple components and elements. And it was a really amazing show about identity and about how you can define your identity through your creativity, but also this sort of the challenge of masculinity when in the absence of a empathetic and relatable male role model, who actually, I think, isolated him in some way. But yeah, it sort of builds on what you were saying about Henry Strang. There's a sort of a darkness at the heart of it. But in the end, it was quite redemptive because for Simeon, it all came out, through creativity. It was that's how he found his expression and his comfort within himself.
That's just fascinating to hear somebody, or to hear about somebody telling that kind of story of the experiences that shaped them, and
incredibly vulnerable. I mean, I came away going, that was really courageous, because I know these kind of memoir type shows are quite popular, or these performances are quite popular, but that's because they feel so authentic. Because you're listening to someone talking really honestly and tenderly about the things that they've wrestled with through their lives. And I don't think it's solipsistic. I mean, it could be, or it could be a bit narcissistic, but actually I think he did it brilliantly and took us to very dark places and then leavened it with humor quite judiciously, so it was both sort of punchy and funny.
Oh, thanks for telling me about that. So I have one more book to share. I came back from America, and I can say, in a sort of homage to Polyphemus the Cyclops in the Odyssey, nothing was waiting for me. What's it? He says, no one poked my eye out. Nothing was waiting for me. Notes on nothing. The joy of nobody.
I really hope that book's empty. It's just full of blank.
It actually, I mean, the words are beautifully spaced out, but there are words. Wow. It is an account of an experience of nothingness, an experience of a dissolution of selfhood. And it was sent to me by somebody who knows the author. So I've actually had the chance to be in touch with the author. But one of the things I felt when I read it, firstly, it's rare to encounter these kinds of experiences being described in a way that isn't getting packaged up to try and sell you enlightenment. I do have another example that I love, and again, I'll drop this in the show notes. There is an episode of a podcast. I don't even remember what the podcast is called. The episode is called The Hillbilly Sutra, and it's a banjo player from Nashville who had, a similar kind of experience, an experience of just, the dropping away of selfhood, of what in certain traditions would be talked about in terms of non-duality. Actually, you can find within Christian mystical tradition equivalent experiences being narrated with other language and conceptual frames for them, I think. But what I've always loved about the Hillbilly Sutra is that this guy, he's just sat down in a studio to record this because his mate asked him to make a recording of the story, but he has no interest in being a guru or a teacher or telling you how useful this is going to be to you. And in a similar spirit, this anonymously written, beautifully produced little book is somebody who's a very skilled writer who has had this experience where for 2 weeks, just normal sense of selfhood and otherhood and the boundaries which structure normal experience of the world dissolved, and is then and then at some point afterwards, found themselves writing the story of that experience. But I remember years ago being somehow ending up in the back row of a massive hall somewhere in London, where nearly everybody else in the hall was there because they were devotees of Eckhart Tolle. And I was there because somebody who had been involved in arranging the event had given me a free ticket, and I was curious. And my experience, I mean, Eckhart Tolle is one of these kind of big, super celebrity new age gurus. I think
he's quite petite, actually.
But, well, yeah, he's slightly squashed. It felt like seeing a great ape in a concrete enclosure at the zoo. Like, here was somebody who had clearly had, a very powerful mystical experience, and who appeared to be trapped inside the industry that had been built around his experience. And so, just at that level alone, I salute the sanity of, if you're going to write about this stuff, put it out anonymously. Because right now we're not, like, our cultural setup is so set up to transform anything and everything into an object of consumption.
It's a product.
Yeah. So those are just a few of the things that have that I've been reading in the time since we've been apart. Last time I saw you, and this isn't like a end of last series cliffhanger because we didn't actually record anything, but last time I saw you was election night, or the morning after.
Oh God, yeah.
In the UK in July, and we went and took Charlotte Ducan out for dinner on election night at a pub on the Suffolk coast, and then drove back with the car radio beginning to tell us the projections as polls closed, and I drifted in and out of consciousness with the BBC coverage playing on my laptop in your living room through the night, and then was gently awoken by your daughter and the other kids who were staying there in the morning as they were getting ready to head off to school. But I sort of want to ask you, UK 100 and odd days after that election, how's it feeling?
Can I use a metaphor?
Use a metaphor.
So and this actually was the thing that prompted you, I think, to kind of galvanize us to get it.
This is going to be the metaphor that involves the robot vacuum cleaner, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So
tell us about the robot vacuum cleaner.
So I came across this story. It's obviously been doing the rounds, but it was basically about a family who had a robot vacuum cleaner in the living room that was programmed to do its job, during the early hours of the morning. Obviously when everyone else was in bed, so it would just whir around and do all the hoovering. Which was fine up until the point that the new puppy did an unexpected deposit on the rug in aforesaid early hours of the morning, which the robot vacuum cleaner then very diligently and methodically spread around the entire room. So you can imagine the mess when it's going into every corner, brushing up against furniture, along the sides of the walls, into the carpet. So the poor
fine-grained even distribution of dog poo.
Yeah, great. I mean, just brilliantly done. Doing exactly its job to algorithmically cover every inch of that living room in order to make sure the entire floor is vacuumed, or indeed covered in poop. So the family was sort of met with a slightly horrific scene where they came down in the morning, and I think that is the literal enshittification.
You went there. I was thinking of that. Yes.
Yeah, and I'm not totally despondent. I mean, it was a very quick and exciting start. It felt like we had adults in the room immediately after the election, for the first time in years. I think it also is a reflection of how hostile the right-wing media are, in particular, to any idea of a Labour government doing anything well. And so, immediately we've been zeroed in on hypocrisy around gifts and all of that kind of, all the noise of politics, which I just find very wearying now. And not in a kind of hell on both your houses or a curse on plague on both your houses, as some people do. I just find it really difficult, especially when you then get someone like Boris Johnson, writing pontificating columns about elected politicians accepting gifts. It's like there is an enormous pot here which is painted the blackest of black, and it's calling the kettle the same thing.
There's an enormous shame deficit.
Oh, yeah.
I want to stay with the robot vacuum cleaner a little bit longer, because as you were bringing that um, that image that has haunted me since you shared it and shared the thing that the person involved had written about the experience, which was grimly well written.
Yeah, robot lawnmowers do the same thing, by the way.
Do they?
If you let your dog loose in the garden, obviously the lawnmower will quite happily spread the dog poo all over the lawn, whilst cutting it at the same time.
So the great philosopher of technology who missed his vocation as a gangster rapper, Paul Virilio, said that every new technology brings into being a new kind of catastrophe. So I think for one thing, we've got an example of that. But somehow, like the robot vacuum cleaner, like the gap between the intention and the result in that story just feels emblematic of I don't want to say everything in 2024, but
a lot of things. I mean, Cory Doctorow, the tech analyst, said this. I think he coined the term enshittification.
yes.
I mean, weirdly, the day I saw that story was the day I was in Portugal giving a talk about sustainable technology. Unfortunately, I saw the story after I'd given the talk, because I was kind of gutted, because that would have been a very central, emblematic example as part of my unfolding narrative. But there was someone else talking after me, amazing lady called Jessica Grootman, who runs the regenerative technology project out in California. And she was sort of offering the antidote, if you like, to enshittification. And the way she described it really stuck with me, because she used to be an anthropologist and an archaeologist. So she'd started off, studying all sorts of human behavior and culture. And she said, the Stone Age was us using crude tools really smartly. Basically, we can make very sharp things and we can use very crude tools in a really smart way. Because the information age, the enshittification we're right in the middle of right now, is us using smart tools really crudely, basically to compound and go down the cul-de-sac of making an extractive and exploitative colonial system like a bit more efficient, which is like using smart tools really, and the regenerative technology age, if we can burgeon it in, welcome it in, has to be us using these smart tools in a smart way, because that could unlock something. At the minute, we're absolutely the opposite of that, which is why, X, under the auspices of, dark Margot Musk, has now become a sort of basket case of psychopathy. And I know you have a long history of avoiding that platform, but I don't think it's alone. I mean, the discussions that you and I have had about which platform to record this on, it shouldn't be difficult.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I want to come back to Musk, the Musk apocalypse, but before we go there, the other thought that came to me around vacuum cleaners and technology, there was a TV series, gosh, it must be nearly 20 years ago, called Meet the Natives. I might even have talked about this on an earlier episode, but it was the premise was it was a 3-part documentary where these 5 guys from a tribal village in Vanuatu were coming to the British Isles, and it was reverse anthropology. They were coming to study.
This does ring a bell.
Yeah, they were coming to study the 3 tribes of the British Isles: the middle class, the working class, and the upper class. And I'm certain that you could all sorts of critiques could be made of it. I thought it was a very revealing, in a good way, piece of work, because there were just so many encounters in which ordinary things, taken for granted things about different aspects of British ways of living, seen through the eyes of these guys, were revealed in their absurdity or their horror or whatever else. But one of the early ones was in the first episode. They were staying with this family who were representing the middle class, who were a farming family. They had a pig farm. That was sort of why they were there, because pigs were important to the life of the village that they'd come from. And on one of the days, they're helping the farmer's wife doing the cleaning. And, kind of laughing at the ridiculousness of this vacuum cleaner and at the vastness of this house with these two people living in it. And there's a moment where she's sort of dusting this figurine with two figures that's sort of halfway up the staircase on a windowsill. And one of the guys is like, so who are they? Tell me the story. And it is incomprehensible to him that you would have an object depicting two people in your home that you have to clean every week as part of your weekly cleaning and not know who they are. And to me, like, the concept that formed for me out of that moment in that program was the stuff to meaning ratio. I was like, there has never been a way of being human together in which the ratio between stuff and meaning has been as out of whack.
Yeah.
And so, the kind of shadow work in Illich's terms, rather than in the Jungian sense of shadow work, the shadow work, all of the extra work that is created in order to do the maintenance of the kind of lives that we're having and taking for granted, is part of where the need for robot vacuum cleaners even begins to come from. And so my hope would be that, yes, sure, that the regenerative technology age or whatever it is an age of being less dumb in the way that we're using things, but also that it's an age of just recognizing how much of the stuff we've been doing, how much of the stuff we've been making, buying, selling, cleaning, living with, cluttering up our lives with over just the last handful of generations is junk, is kind of nonsense, is substitute for living together in ways that might actually allow us to have lives worth living and be showing up in a way that might mean that that's possible as something that can be ongoing rather than something that is a pattern of self-destruction, as how rate of living seemed to be.
Yeah, someone said to me this morning, just before I came on the call, they were discussing like COP in Colombia, the biodiversity COP. And how only like 10% of the attending nations have even submitted a biodiversity plan. But their line was, we're basically swapping the wealth of life for lifeless trinkets. It's like, that just about, I think it's back to your kind of stuff to meaning ratio. And I think, to be fair to Jessica, actually, when she was doing the pitch for regenerative tech, she was sort of saying, actually, the essential principle is reconnection with ecological and social health. That's right. That should be your kind of filter. Does this reconnect us to each other in a way which is effective and wholesome and meaningful? Yeah. And does it connect us back into the web of life? And my favorite example of that, which I might have mentioned before, but do you remember Marshmallow Laser Feast? Have you come across them? No. They do, a great name apart from anything else, but they do what I would describe as sort of extended reality, augmented reality using VR. But they had an extraordinary installation in the Saatchi Gallery a few years ago in London, where you went into a basement and you donned, your VR headset and a backpack, and you had these gloves that went on your arms, and then you walked into a giant sequoia forest, and you could see the blood vessels flowing and the red blood cells in your arms and the veins and arteries. You could see the gases, coming out of your mouth, the carbon dioxide, and then you could see them being absorbed by the trees and the plants, and then it would start raining, and then you could see the rain coming up. You could see the transpiration of the water up through the xylem vessels of the trees. You could walk into the tree and be amongst all of those vessels. I mean, as someone who's trained as a biologist, it was like, I knew all of this stuff was going on, but to be in it, and to have that sort of sight beyond sight in the Thundercats way, where, you suddenly, everything that is intangible was suddenly made incredibly tangible and visible. And it was so emotional. People were coming out of it crying, and it was such a fantastically beautiful use of technology, where it's like going,
Yeah.
now I feel completely immersed and connected into nature in a way that I just haven't before, because I'm literally in it.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of trickster use of technology is always something that I have a kind of sympathy for. I think of Simon McBurney in what's it called? Is it The Encounter? It's something like
The Encounter,
yeah, where the headphones to me are, in their default way of showing up in the world, a technology of disconnection. And I say that as someone who uses them, but you put your headphones on and you are making it clear to everyone around you that you want to be inside your personal world rather than open to any kind of human interaction with the people you're actually in the same space bodily with. And in The Encounter,
it's okay to say I don't like them.
Yeah. But in The Encounter, the headphones are used in this theatre setting to create this extraordinary experience of intimacy, where you're sitting there and you feel like Simon's kind of whispering into your ear, because he's whispering into these special microphones that they're using. Have I ever told you about the idea of technology as scaffolding?
Possibly.
We've done so many of these episodes. Like we're not young men anymore, Ed. We might have been when we started, but our memories are going to be
Gandalf 1 and 2. Gandalf 1 and 2.
Our beards get longer and our memories get shorter. But just around the beginning of the pandemic, so actually around the same time you and I started talking together and then recording these conversations, I had a conversation with William Wardlaw Rogers, in which we landed on this image of, what if a whole lot of the technologies that we have around us now are not stepping stones towards more and more advanced versions of these things, and are not terrible sources of corruption that we ought to disconnect from entirely as soon as we can, but turn out to be scaffolding that we put to uses that were not the uses often that were designed and built into these technologies, but we put to the use of, in my terms, regrowing a living culture, where to the extent that we get closer to that, we will need these things less. And I don't want to put too much weight on that, because it's clearly not the dominant way in which any of these technologies are showing up in the world. But it is sort of the approach that I take to using these tools, to doing things that are, I don't believe, are going to be around for the long haul. I cannot see how this kind of high-tech civilization that we've had around here lately is likely to be, the platform on which humanity is here for the long haul, which isn't to say that I can tell you which bits we are and aren't going to take with us in the ruins. But that image of using it as scaffolding, because the thing about scaffolding is when the house is built, you take down the scaffold.
Take it down. Yeah. And if it's made of bamboo, you just compost it.
There we go. Yeah. I say this as a man who has built scaffolding.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, part of what I was saying in my talk on sustainable technology was, exploring the oxymoron, obviously, but referencing Marvin Kreutzberg, who came up with the 5 laws of technology. And the first one I think is technology is not neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. Yes. And every new technology is like a portal. It's like a doorway, a threshold. And at the same time, you have a choice about whether you cross the threshold. But that threshold is also an invitation, which is why we get into this philosophical mess where we go, oh, I'm going to step through. And once you go through and you cross that threshold, you often find yourselves in constrained corridors of possibility, because it's like, you can't go back. You're in it now. The genie's out the bottle. What do we say? The cat's out the bag. And then you find yourself where your options are quite limited. And the image I use in my talks is like the corridor in the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Like, say which door do you want to open,
Right.
and which door should you open? But the issue there is the decisions on which thresholds are crossed and which constrained corridors of possibility we find ourselves in are being made by a very, very small number of people right now. Like, literally, we know their names. You can count them on two hands.
And this is back to what we talked about in the last series with Neto Liao and his Illichian description of how there are these social thresholds that are crossed before we get to the ecological thresholds.
Yeah, I mean, some argue it's a sort of necessary madness, this period. You think you could argue it from a sort of Jungian perspective, that the sort of psychic epidemic of the enshittification of the body politic and the ecological context and our social relationships. You almost have to take stuff to the edge and break it before you can repair it and rebuild it. And I know that will chime with you, but I think Jung would say this is all about the kind of the flushing out of the shadow. Like, the shadow is there and we're being brutally confronted with it. Whether it's American election, it's the reality of trying to navigate through, a mature neoliberal economy in the context of a climate and ecological crisis, while half the world seems to want to go to war.
Didn't Jung have a vision of God doing a giant turd and it landing on top of the cathedral? I think shit is definitely a theme in this. In this episode, but I've derailed myself now. With
what I can say, so that's quite an image.
I'll tell you the where I was going. Why God came to mind was a friend of mine, Tollef Graf Hugo, a Norwegian philosopher and bus driver. He once said to me something similar to what you were saying, and you were saying it in this kind of Jungian way. But he said, I sometimes think it's like the parable of the prodigal son. And that where we're at the moment, this kind of end game of modernity is the moment in the story where the son is eating the peace gods alongside the pigs in their trough before the moment of turning and going, like, this is just madness. However bad it is, if I were to turn around and go home and face the shame of that, it would be better than this. And there's some, like, for all of the kind of material achievements, all of the things that can be plotted on Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker style graphs, there is a quality of that moment in the story to this enshittified kind of like endgame. And I know, like, smart people say, what worries me is that the end game is on kind of endless loop, that it doesn't end. And I get that as well. But somehow there is something of that moment in the story. And maybe that's why I want to come back to the Musk apocalypse, because I think the last bit that might be worth trying to talk about today, and then we will just come back in another episode to think like my America trip and so on. But before and after going to America, I've done a few talks that helped me think some things through this summer here in Sweden. Firstly, at the European Eco Village gathering, and then I did a sort of online follow-up to that, where the Global Eco Village Network had At Work in the Ruins as their book club book, and so I came and talked to them on that, and then I gave the keynote at the Swedish Transition Network conference the weekend before last, which was a really good gathering to be a part of. But in the Gen book club thing, I got a really good question, which is, someone said, why didn't you mention transition at all in At Work in the Ruins? And I thought about it, and I said, I think it reflects the moment in which I was writing the book. And partly that it was still like so much of when I'm writing about movements in the book, I'm reflecting on and feeling the need to reflect on that immediately pre-pandemic moment of Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future and the rest of it. And so that kind of what was to me temporarily an earlier moment of the kind of great sort of flourishing of the first phase of the transition towns movement and so on was slightly in the shadow of or eclipsed by the intensity and the different temporality of XR and the rest of it. And I remember sitting with Gail Bradbrook and one of the other founders of XR and the Dark Mountain team in 2019, a few weeks after that spring rebellion that was really the peak of XR in that form, and just experiencing the Dark Mountain group. We were gathering, and it was 10 years since Dark Mountain had started, and I was in the process of leaving, and so we were having our sort of final kind of firekeepers gathering before I left. And then Gail and the others from XR were in this heat of this very new thing that had a totally different temporality, a different rhythm, different relation to time to it. But anyway, I said to this guy, I think if I were writing at Work in the Ruins now, maybe transition would come into it, or rather when I write whatever it is that's coming next. And part of what that's about is I think 5 years ago, I felt like the language of transition had been almost entirely captured by what I want to call the Tesla transition.
Yeah.
Whenever I heard transition being used, it was about the clean energy transition. It was about how we can swap out the fossil fuels for electric vehicles. The electricity is going to come from mumble because electricity isn't a fuel. But it was this vision which was premised on the idea that the only thing that was wrong with our way of living was its resource use and emissions, which is just like fundamentally not true. And so I think transition as a language felt to me at that moment as if it had been captured by what I call the big path in the book. And what I realized when I was asked to think about this, and then when I was talking to the transition gathering here in Sweden, was I think we're coming out the far side of that. I think that there is, in quite mainstream contexts, a disillusionment with the promise of the Tesla transition. And I think that maybe part of that is simply Musk's own trajectory and the kind of character he has revealed himself to be. But I thought about it when I watched the new series of Sherwood, the drama that's set in Nottinghamshire. And they had a plot line within it involving these two rather scummy characters, one of whom is the son of the kind of super rich made good guy who was Thatcher's man in the coalfields 40 years ago during the strike. And the other of whom is the son of the local kind of small time crime family. And they're both haggling over making profit out of this solar farm on part of the crime family's land. I'm just like, yeah, like the cultural energy has shifted. And there is a sense of the get rich quick scheme quality of a lot of what was being sold 5 years ago about the big path version of how we're going to deal with all of this. And I'm sure that people could respond and go, oh, well, you see, that's because of the amount of propaganda from the vested interests that want to delay the energy transition. But I hope that actually it might be part of a kind of realizing that the shit has been smeared all over the carpet.
Yeah.
And that, we need to start from there instead of starting from how wonderfully promising this robot vacuum cleaner is.
I totally agree. And I think it's ironic, isn't it, that in 5 or 6 series of The Great Humbling, which, in a way, shit is the most humbling aspect of life and connection, that it's taken us this long to get around to talking about.
You're saying we've been a bit constipated, Ed?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but I think you're right, and I think Rebecca Solnit said something similar the other week about having some of the answers to the challenges we face, but not deploying them. And I think it's best summed up. There's a Terence McKenna quote, which I shared with someone this morning, which says, we can solve our problems, but it's not clear that we can solve our problems and get rich at the same time. And that's the current requirement for all solutions. And it's made Elon Musk astonishingly rich to the extent that he can bribe people with $1 million a day to register voters in Pennsylvania. And that in itself is probably a corrupt abuse of power.
And so, maybe what we're looking for is fewer robot vacuum cleaners and more compost toilets.
That's a great note to end on.
There we go.
There's a vision.
I think this was the first episode of Series 6, wasn't it, Ed?
I think it was. It felt like it.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @Frucool. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.